I'm Glenn Gare, the Director of Evolutionary Studies here at SUNY New Paltz, and we have a special event today put on by ourselves, the EvoS Club, led by the fearless Brianna Tauber, and the Sustainable Agriculture Group, as well as CAS. Evolutionary Studies prides itself on vision and integration, and taking a look at all the different things there are to understand and finding unifying themes. And the work on the topic of permaculture, which Andrew Faust, our speaker, is going to speak about, really does that in a very big way, taking issues of human nature, the environment, and issues of spirituality and physics and just lots of different fields, and sort of puts them together in a visionary and connected way. And we're very fortunate to have him here today. Alice Andrews, who's a member of our EvoS faculty, has helped me, she's the one who invited Andrew here and has helped me put together a little introduction. And I've learned quite a lot of cool things about Andrew already. It turns out that he is very interested in natural living styles. And he lived for 8 years in West Virginia off the grid, right? That's the phrase. In a homestead which included a 1,600 square foot straw bale house, which sounds like an awesome place to live to me. And from there, he moved to Brooklyn. So he had a big life change, I'm assuming, in 2007. And from that point, he has become a major teacher of the topic of permaculture. He has a campus and a school in Brooklyn where he teaches about this particular topic. He teaches about this in Ellenville as well, where he is developing the Center for Bioregional Living, and he is doing this along with his partner Adriana and their baby daughter Juniper. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Faust.
Thank you. Thanks, Glenn. I appreciate it. I'll have to adjust to hearing my voice coming from the hall, so... My name is Andrew Faust. I've been teaching ecological literacy and ways of thinking about how human beings can connect more with what it is that we all come from, which is the earth. It seems like we've kind of lost track of that in the modern industrialized technocratic society that we live in the cozy bosom of, that we're sitting here right now this evening in the seat of its creature comforts that cause us to oftentimes lose a sense of connection, which is kind of understandable when you're in a hall like this with absolutely no windows to the outside world. And when you look at academic institutions' office and how their campuses are often designed, you see places that lack a sense of interconnection and are very good at a sense of isolation. So what I hope to share with you in a very large hall with very few people, don't be afraid, I don't bite up here, but you'll be able to see it all up on the screen. Big screen, big life, big world, right? The modern era, it's all about a bunch of splash-in-the-pan phenomenons. Who knows how long we're here for? Who knows how long this funny bubble that we happen to be riding in the postmodern era is going to continue to keep us afloat. And that type of cynicism will be a theme that you'll catch as a perspective that I bring as a speaker, as a thinker, as a human being on planet Earth today. I think it's difficult not to be cynical. And I hope to share with you kind of a narrative vision of our evolution, our life on Earth, from the Western analytical scientific worldview, but kind of combining it with some things that are intuition, that our heart-mind energy is informing us about. Because a huge part of what I think a lot of you who are really deep in the nest of this academic world can identify with is that we really lack the ability to, as a culture, give a sense of purpose behind why all of this intellectual development is worthwhile, unless it's supposedly for some means by which you're going to make more money, or perhaps become enlightened, although I don't think many college students these days are here to become enlightened, but possibly. The question that I want to bring to our experience this evening is kind of the question of, what is our purpose on life? What is our purpose as human beings? What does it mean to be alive on planet Earth? And what can we kind of start to piece together about our story? What is our story? And I think that one of the things that continues to fascinate me is the theory of evolution. Even though 50% of the state of Kansas would argue with me that it's even a valid perspective to have on the world, I'm still attached to it. As are a lot of people, apparently, who have PhDs and spend lots of money and time to have dissertations that are oftentimes arguably idiosyncratic and add up to what? I think it's important that we hold ourselves to a higher set of expectations. I mean, words like higher and lower are, of course, loaded. But what I mean by that is that higher in the sense of, why do anything? And I would posit to you that what I'm going to present to you tonight as permaculture design, which is this discipline of a bunch of different fields coming together under the aegis of an endeavor to create a better life for ourselves as biological beings on a ecological planet. How do we create a way of living that is informed by what science tells us and is informed by what just sort of intuitively makes sense as we attempt to reason our way? Reason is also useful insofar as we recognize its limitations, right? Reason our way into a way of living that is articulate, that is intelligent, that makes sense in terms of the long-term well-being of ourselves as individuals and the collective well-being of all species, all children through all time. I think it's worth our while to take on and completely achievable for us to take on the work of living in ways that honor our own long-term well-being as well as our short-term well-being and the well-being of all species and all children through all time. Totally achievable, totally doable. And the first place to start in the privileged class Western G20 wealthy nations world is to do less. So first we start with, in permaculture, our first attitudinal principle. Permaculture has these principles, which are kind of axioms for how to begin. Well, you know, the first thing is, if you're digging yourself into a hole, you know, stop digging, right? It's one of the first things to do. And the best way to do that is to first, when in doubt, do nothing. And overall, the world would be a better place if more people in the privileged class G20 wealthy nations who are on mood-stabilizing drugs and buying a lot of junk they don't need to fill a void that can't be filled with stuff. The whole world would benefit by more of us just doing less. Just doing nothing. And in fact, the more that we do nothing, the more that we actually begin to get grounded in what it is that we've actually inherited through arguably longer than 4.5 billion years of evolution, but more like 15 billion years of cosmic and stellar processes that make it possible for us to be here now, as Ram Dass has coined the term, be here now. Right? What does it mean to be here now? Well, the first thing it means is just be. And the second one is what is here? And then, of course, the third one is what is now. Right? So being. What does it mean to be a human being? And what I'm suggesting is that as we reorient ourselves, individually and collectively, we will be well served by a way of thinking that is both timelessly ancient, like the way in which physics and Hinduism talk about the cycles of the universe being things like an in-breath and out-breath that happen on 15 billion year time cycles, to the awareness that we have of the incredible barrage of information, energy, and power that we have at our fingertips in the modern era as members of a privileged class G20 wealthy nation. And how do we navigate that reality that we exist in the midst of? So that's where I'll give you some images, some ways to think about that. I mean, part of why I first went and lived off the grid for 8 years was really to try to get a sense of what do you need and what don't you need. Because I think a lot of you can probably identify with the fact that as a sort of suburban, rural kid growing up in the United States in a house that was kind of unique, it was a passive solar house that was heated by a wood stove, I still had an incredible amount of buffer from actually experiencing any sort of hardship. So I had to self-induce hardship in order to get a sense of what can I do for myself? What do I really need? If it's -30 out with wind chill, how am I going to make it through that night if I don't have a furnace and a heater and connections to the power grid? So that for me, it was what I call living off the grid for 8 years was an intentional, self-designed, immersive permaculture PhD project. Because it was 5 years after I'd already studied this discipline that I'll be talking to you about and teaching it to high school kids in my own curriculums that I created that are semester-long programs, one of which is called Humans from Earth, which is the gist of what we'll look at tonight. The second is called Transforming Worldviews, and it's about how to uncondition the conditioned mind from the dross we've been inundated with from the media and propaganda moguls of the country, and how to take those same methodologies and use them for your own agenda, which I think is important too. And the third class was called Bioregionalism. And I'm really into this idea of bioregionalism. Even though it has a lot of syllables and it's esoteric and not many people know what the heck it is, I still find it a useful word to associate what I'm trying to teach with. Because I like to try to, when I use words and share ideas with an audience like I am tonight, I try to have us extend our capacity a little bit beyond where we're totally used to going. And so a word like bioregional for me, as a thinker, as a designer, has really been an insightful term because it still is something that I'm growing into, and it still continues to offer a very useful way to think about what is our design goal. What can we, as individuals, practically ground our new societies, our new economies, our ways of living that aren't disconnected from the flux and flow of what it means to be a biological organism on Earth. So as we think about our lives here, you know, according to modern physics, the universe is dated at about 4.5 billion years old. I'm sorry, 15 billion years old. The Earth is dated at 4.5 billion years old. And the universe is dated at about 14.5 billion. And this vision of what our world is has been made up by the Hubble telescope and various other technological devices. Now, of course, you can assume that there's a lot that they can't see. But of what we can see with these devices, according to modern physics, the edge of the known universe is about 15 billion light years away. There might have been another universe before this Big Bang. There's still debate and working theories around, was there a Big Bang that preceded this Big Bang? Is that why there's so much dark matter and so much other energy in our universe that can't quite be accounted for by one Big Bang event? So that now you're hearing in physics the idea of an endless universe, which is the notion that what's happening is that the universe has a Big Bang event, expands, and then contracts again, and has another Big Bang event, and expands, and then contracts again. And that this is happening on something like 15, 20, 30 billion year time cycles. So it's a long time. It's a lot of processes. It's a lot of stuff that generally, as we're sitting here on planet Earth rocketing around the sun, we're not usually remembering and checking in with. And it is helpful to, I think, appreciate that the cosmic implications of what modern physics is saying lack nothing in terms of their spiritual, metaphysical, intangible characteristics. Right? And then we look at things like this and we start to yawn and get kind of like, oh my gosh, the table of elements. This is dry. But what we want to remember about what this is telling us is that, in fact, everything on the planet that's larger than hydrogen and helium, according to modern physics, came from the center of a star in another solar system before we ever came about. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that, to realize that, again, like why it is that the first principle of good design in the modern world is to do nothing, is because of the fact that your innate cellular wisdom, which has far more power than whatever it is we can deduce from what we've learned by creating the table of elements, your innate cellular wisdom is older than the planet itself. So if you ask yourself, how old is the silica molecule in my thumbnail? It's actually older than the Earth, because it had to be created in the center of a star in another solar system before this planet ever came about. Right? So if you look at what physics is saying, is that everything larger than hydrogen and helium, and in fact really everything larger than hydrogen, because according to the Big Bang theory, the only major element that was around post the Big Bang event was a lot of hydrogen. And all this hydrogen started to create giant stellar furnaces that started to generate helium, which is what our sun creates. Right? Our sun is sort of a medium-sized sun. And as it creates helium in its core, it generates massive quantities of solar plasma and radiation that's constantly bombarding the planets that surround the sun. The sun of our solar system is 90% of the mass of our solar system. So it's the biggest thing going on planet Earth, is the sun. And the first thing you do to design your society, to design your buildings, to design your lives as human beings to be more in balance with how the cosmos works, is to pay attention to the sun. It's really simple, but it's vastly missed and ignored by most of modern architecture. So understanding that the silica molecule in our thumbnail, that everything on the table of elements, especially uranium-235, which used to be the largest element on the planet's surface, and is the one by which we date the planet because it has a daughter isotope named lead. And for every place on the planet's surface that we found uranium, we found the same proportionate ratio of lead to it. And the deduction has been that because everywhere on the planet's surface you find the same ratio of lead as you do to uranium, that mole for mole in laboratories it's been analyzed how long it would take for this much uranium to turn into this much lead. Ipso facto, the planet is dated at 4.5 billion years on the basis of what's called uranium half-life, the daughter isotope of uranium. So the planet and how it works, and the sun being the major furnace and the engine that drives all of the processes on the planet, is key to permaculture and ecological design. Realizing that we're on a planet that is traveling through outer space at 65,000 miles per hour right now in its orbit around the sun. It's spinning 1,000 miles per hour east at the equator, and it's 24,901 miles in circumference. Because of its 1,000 per hour spin, it's creating a 4-mile bulge at the equatorial radius. So it's a very dynamic system. We still don't have, according to astrophysics, a good explanation of the origin of the moon. Go and dig into it a little bit. You'll find out NASA, all the major scientific papers and journals will agree that there's no solid accepted theory on the origin of the moon. I think that's a pretty big deal, because I think it's pretty interesting that in a world where we consider ourselves so advanced, we can't even explain the origin of the major satellite of the planet Earth, right? One of the things that's particularly amazing about the Earth that also isn't very often talked about, because these days we're sort of myopically all talking about carbon, and carbon, and forgetting about things like the electromagnetic field of the planet and how the biosphere actually works. Oh, and just as an aside, forgetting that carbon is a plant food and radioactive waste isn't, which is kind of interesting when you think about some of the myopic solution sets that the climate chaos doomers want to put upon us, like nukes are somehow a good idea. My feeling about radioactive energy is that there's enough of it already on the planet. We don't need a sconch. I don't trust, and I use that word very intentionally, trust is what has been violated when it comes to the relationship between the American public and the federal government and private industry. I do not trust them, and I do not encourage you as a thinking, intelligent adult to trust the way in which these regulatory agencies supposedly are going to keep us from being exposed to an unacceptable amount. Check out the top 10 most polluted and radioactive sites on the planet, and you'll see that right now Fukushima is rated as #1. All because of a nuclear power plant. Not the place where they manufactured the uranium for Fat Man and Little Boy, the Hanford site out in Washington, which is leaking 200,000 gallons a day, according to the EPA and the Department of Energy, into the Columbia River. That's not #1, that's actually #10. So it's interesting to understand that we live on a radioactive planet. The only reason the planet has an EMF field is because the core of the planet is burning at 7,000 degrees Kelvin because of uranium, nickel, cadmium, thorium, iron, and potassium. It's highly radioactive at the core. Of course, last time I gave a presentation on this, somebody asked me, well, how do we know what the inside of the Earth is made up of? Anybody know the history behind that story? No, by nuclear testing. That's how. Because Edward Teller was able to sit in the basement of a high-rise building, the sick megalomaniac who designed the hydrogen bomb. There's absolutely nothing positive about the hydrogen bomb. It takes a sick mind to design the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is the one that incinerates people but leaves the buildings around. Awesome. That's great. What a great tactical invention. So Edward Teller's there in the basement of a high-rise in Manhattan after they move all these indigenous people off their island in Bikini. So we can put a bunch of Navy ships there with a bunch of goats that we shave the hair off of, chained to the decks. at ground zero and detonate the first 1 megaton. Remember, the bombs they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki probably didn't stop and talk about this much in history class unless you happen to read somebody more radical like Howard Zinn. Or 1 kiloton. Nagasaki probably just done to see what happens when you explode one about 50 miles up, because 1 made the point, right? Hiroshima made the point. 1 megaton hydrogen bomb blew up the Bikini Atoll, and Edward Teller was able to sit there and look at a seismograph in the basement of a high-rise building in Manhattan and know that the test of his hydrogen bomb had been successful. And it was from these tests that physicists were able to put together kind of like an ultrasound for Mother Earth, with hydrogen nuclear bombs being how it is that you're looking inside of the embryo to see the shape of the baby. And in fact, this is how sick the Western scientific mind is. You know, in order to understand mycelium in forests, we injected plutonium that was dyed blue. So then you could see the plutonium that was dyed blue traveled through the mycelial webs and showed up in the mycelial fabric on the other side of a forest network. And thereby scientists were able to go, aha, yes, we were able to trace it. Of course, we used plutonium, which somewhat contradicts the positiveness of that insight. So this is a whole mixed bag, right? What I'm getting at is this story, it's useful, it's insightful, but what has it actually been used for? Right? What are we actually doing with physics? Generally, we're not recognizing that we sit on a planet in outer space, rocketing around the sun at 65,000 miles per hour, and there's no omniscient narrator that cares about whether human existence continues to eke out some modicum of a quality of life rocketing around the sun in outer space on a globe that's 24,901 miles in circumference, that only has so much space and so much opportunity for us to live well. How are we going to do that? What's our story, right? The electromagnetic field of the planet is what creates the aurora borealis. It's because of the interaction of the EMF field with the solar plasma coming off of the sun. Now, 500 million years ago, this is where all the plates were. Today, this is where they are. So in 500 million years, they've traveled quite a bit. And on a planet that's dated at 4.5 billion years, for 4 billion years of evolution, life stayed in the ocean. About 3,500 million years ago, we have bacteria showing up in the ocean on planet Earth. About 2,000 million years ago, we have protists showing up. About 600 million years ago, we have animals. And about 450 million years ago, we have plants and fungi showing up on planet Earth. Now, I know you can't read that chart, but if any of you have taken a geology class, you've seen that chart. And what's very interesting about this chart that's above me right now is that 4 billion years is that little bottom part that has no color that they're calling the Precambrian, right? And I think it's fascinating that a science that calls itself geology, that's supposedly looking at the ancient substrata of the fabric of the physical structure of the Earth, barely spends any time talking about basically 2/3 of the Earth's history, 4 billion years. So that if you look at modern geology and you look at the story of life on Earth, you'll see that we spend the bulk of our time, well, depends on what discipline and what courses you're in, but generally the most far back you're going to go is about 500 million years. And I mean, really, most of the life forms that we're familiar with came about in the last 65 million years. So for 4.5 billion years, this is the most complex. You know, after about 4 billion years, we see things like I mean, this is pretty cool. Bioluminescent bacteria. Awesome. 4 billion years, and we have flatworms and jellyfish, right? Which I think is fascinating when you look at this time scale and you realize, wow, we're talking about a universe that's 15 billion years old. We're talking about a planet that's 4.5 billion years old. And on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old, it took 4 billion years for anything as complex as just a flatworm or a jellyfish to come about. And it's a very dynamic system. I mean, my emphasis here again, I know you can't really see it, but on the right side of this chart, you can tell as you see those little mini Earth globes that the place where the plates have been has changed a lot. Plate tectonics is pretty radical. It's right up there with things like the Ice Age and the Age of the Planet and Darwin. They were all pretty radical, right? Like initially, just in the 1800s, Europeans thought the Earth was 5,000 years old and would have fought you tooth and nail about the notion that anything even like glaciers existed, right? And again, my point here is not to say, oh, people were so ignorant in the past and we're so enlightened. It's rather to say, what are we doing with this awesome knowledge that we have now? What are we doing with it? Are we designing a world that's informed by it? When we design a building, when we design the way in which we create power, are we thinking about the more ancient, timeless processes of evolution, geology, and the physics of the planet? And are we capitalizing on the physics of how the Earth works in how it is that we're creating power, how it is that we're building buildings, how it is that we're growing food, how it is that we're creating textiles that keep us warm as we're walking around outside? What are they made from? Where are they coming from? What were they made out of? Right? And this all comes back to a true, in my view, and what I'm presenting here tonight, is the notion that we can anchor what really is good design in a depth of understanding of the physics of the universe, the geology of the planet, the evolution of life on Earth, and our own biology and anthropology and sociology and psychology. That these things all add up to a narrative, storyline, that has an informed thread as to what is an intelligent trajectory for us to take as we create protocols by which to design our way out of a system and an infrastructure that is ignorant of the real physics of how the Earth works and is doing things that are self-destructive and nihilistic. So why did life stay in the ocean for almost 4 billion years? And we know a lot of mammals went back to the ocean after being on the land. If you ask yourself, what is it about water that's different than air? If you're on a planet in outer space where it gets freezing cold at night and then it gets really hot in the daytime. And the main difference here, and this is an important design clue for how to design our way out of ways of living that are energetically not well situated. And it comes down to one basic concept here, which is thermal mass. Meaning that if you look at the Earth and you say, when the sun goes down at night, where's a more moderate place to be if I'm a biological entity on this planet rocketing around the sun in outer space? In the womb of life, in the ocean. Why? Because thermal mass of the water doesn't vacillate. And that's a nice place to be if you're a soft, fleshy biological entity of some sort who doesn't necessarily want to exert caloric energy on keeping warm at night or staying cool in the day. And if you want to just sort of float like a jellyfish on your back, as Jimi Hendrix describes us, I think that's a machine gun. You want to have it be in a bath that doesn't get really cold when the sun goes down at night. And that's why life stayed in the ocean for 4 billion years. Rather than being so precocious as to venture out onto this rock slab on this third stone from the sun as it's doing its journey in outer space, right? Because we have to remember that we're on a planet. And how is it that, as Buckminster Fuller calls it, how is it that Spaceship Earth is managing to give us a comfortable ride in outer space? And can we actually intelligently say how what we're doing in a particular way of achieving a design goal is grounded in an empirical understanding of how does the planet give us a comfortable ride in outer space? Are we designing buildings? Are we designing infrastructures? Are we designing the way in which we grow food to be doing a better job of giving us that comfortable ride? What I'm suggesting here, and what Lynn Margulis also agrees with, and has written a really awesome book. If you're not familiar with Lynn Margulis, she's a soil scientist from University of Massachusetts who died, I think, just last year. Lynn wrote a book called Microcosmos, 4 billion years of microbiological evolution on Earth, and with Dorian Sagan. One of my favorite books I'm reading right now is called Into the Cool, Energy Flow, Thermodynamics and Life, Eric Schneider and Dorian Sagan. And it's really fascinating to look at the Earth as a meta-organism, way beyond Gaia, way beyond these sort of like one-sentence pithy phrases that came out of understanding the Earth as a self-regulating entity, but really digging into the nitty-gritty of what does it mean to understand how the Earth actually works. And one of the things that Lynn Margulis says that I think is a very informed perspective for those of us who are larger life forms is that, in fact, the major innovations of life happened in the microbiological world. And in fact, she says that life's age-old ability to reduce energy gradients goes back over 3,800 million years ago. Reducing energy gradients is a term I want to introduce so that we see that what complex ecosystems have been doing is getting better and better at reducing energy gradients. And what life has been doing is getting more and more complex. So 3,800 million years ago, we have bacteria, but we don't have prokaryotic or eukaryotic or sexual reproduction or speciation. And then we have those cellular innovations happening somewhere around 2,000 million years ago. And all the other complex life forms on Earth came out of the microbiological world. Fast forward to somewhere about, if we go back to 65 million years ago, that's the die-off of the dinosaurs. So we have from about 500 million years ago with very, very primitive plant forms up until about 65 million years ago, still not the kinds of deciduous trees and ecological communities that we're familiar with starting to show up. And about 65 million years ago, the die-off of the dinosaurs happens. And Lauren Isley, who wrote A Firmament in Time and The Immense Journey, and is a natural historian who taught at University of Pennsylvania up into the 60s and 70s, Lauren Isley equates our proto-ancestors 65 million years ago to a tree-dwelling gopher. So that's our proto-ancestor, a tree-dwelling gopher. By somewhere about 250,000 million years ago, you have Homo sapiens developing. Now, about 7 million years ago, human beings start to become bipedal hominids, you know, really Ardipithecus in one of the earliest finds is dated at about 4.5 million years ago. Lucy is dated at about 3.5 million years ago as being nothing more than an upright chimp in terms of cranial size. Of course, we know cranial size isn't necessarily what matters. And that it has a lot more to do with how many folds in your brain structure that enable you to store information. But in general, physiologically, biologically, anatomically, Lucy is like an upright chimp, right? And it's about 3.5 million years ago. Now, human beings in general are what we call, a lot like what we call neoteny. And humans are preemies if you compare us to other primates. Most other primates like chimpanzees, bonobos, mountain gorillas, the ones that we classically compare ourselves to, and that according to the Human Genome Project, right, we're 90-some% related to chimpanzees. So we're pretty similar, but we're obviously pretty different too, right? And one of the things that is very different is the gestation time, right? So human babies are born at approximately 9 months. Whereas if you have a Scheduled C, which 40% of births in hospitals in Long Island are Schedule Cs. So that way, because, you know, if you want a certain rising sign in your baby's chart, or maybe the doctor has a golf outing at a particular time, you have a Scheduled C. So generally speaking, 9 months, give or take a few. How long is it for a chimp or for a mountain gorilla or a bonobo? 21 months on average, 21 months. And so part of what I'm emphasizing there is the fact that we have a very long developmental time period. And that developmental time period is key to what it is that enables us to evolve things like culture. And that we have a brain structure where our hearts and our brains are very closely connected, primarily through the mammalian brain. The mammalian brain is the limbic system, and where our endocrine, glandular, and other types of hormone regulatory systems reside, and it's directly connected to the heart and has a very close communication with your heart energy, and your emotional energy is very directly connected to your immune system. And as we understand, the key thing that's really set human beings apart is both this mammalian feeling state mind that gives us a sense of compassion or empathy with other organisms around us, and our unique brain and digestive system, which are directly connected to our evolutionary history and relationship with fire. Now, it turns out that we have one of the shortest intestinal tracts of all primates. We have a super well-developed brain system which uses all of this energy that it's getting from all of these foods that have to be really cooked in order to have all of this nutrient material made available to them. And then also needing to be breastfed regularly so that a baby has this connection developmentally with the face and breath and body of a mother or a caretaker. And there's a real biochemical wisdom and intelligence which keeps our diversity of body parts in a functional wholeness, described by a neurologist, W.B. Cannon, as a vital yet primitive cellular, chemical, hormonal kind of heart intelligence that through the limbic structure maintains the integrated and proper balance of the three parts of our triune brain and all body functions. And according to the Human Microbiome Project, we have something like 205 different flora living on our skin surface alone. 205 different genera of flora, I meant to say. And that's a lot. And that's part of why when babies are born, they really need to be held by another human being so that they become inoculated with these flora that live on our skin, because they're a huge amount of where our immune system comes from. And babies, they've tracked this in hospitals and have found that babies who are whisked off to NICU units and are never held have, for the rest of their lives, compromised immune systems and all kinds of tendencies to allergies. That babies who are held have less, and babies who are breastfed for upwards of 2 years have even less. So there's a lot of evidence to the fact that we've evolved on this planet, that we've evolved around the equatorial rain belt, where it rains something like 115 inches a year on average, and there's lots of poisonous snakes and lots of biting insects, lots of things that could have led to different reasons for us to leave the equatorial rain belt. And we're soft, fleshy biological organisms who are easily damaged and require a great deal of nurturing. Our brains are still developing significantly up into our early 20s. I mean, they continue to develop till the day that we die. But particularly huge growths and spurts are happening up into our early 20s in terms of when are we physiologically and neurologically fully emergent adults. It's not until our early 20s. So it's quite a long time period. And considering that we're neoteny when we first come out, that means we're also very, very vulnerable. And part of what this book that I've been really fascinated by that I'm reading right now called Mothers and Others, part of what Sarah Blaffer Hardy is saying in this is that that's why the human species has had alloparental care for our evolutionary history, because it takes a village to raise a child, right? And that in fact it turns out that's been our history. And really, when we look at our whole capacity to leave the equatorial rain belt, we'll see that it's directly connected to the capacity to start fire. We would have never left the equator if it weren't for the capacity to start fire. Fire is what changed us anatomically, physiologically, and it's what enabled us to spread into biomes where the naked ape would have frozen to death at nighttime, right? So all the way up in the Arctic Circle, people are making they make a candle out of a geode where they put seal blubber in it and have a little wick of moss. And they take that seal blubber and put it onto the wick and make the candle flame a little bit bigger before they go to bed at night. And then when they go into the igloo and go to sleep, they damp it down to one little candle flame. But the only reason they don't freeze to death at night is because they've got one little candle flame of seal blubber burning inside of their igloo. And so fire is key. Fire is still the single greatest technology that human beings have ever figured out, and that sets us apart from all other animals on the planet, is the fact that we know how to start a fire. Now, for most of our evolutionary history, this is how we expressed ourselves, meaning that 100,000 years ago, we've Homo sapiens sapiens. Somewhere around maybe 10 to 7,000 years ago, you have the written word in cuneiform and hieroglyphs. But from the time period of about 70,000 or 100,000 years ago up until about 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, you're talking about anywhere from 70,000 to 90,000 years of human existence, where the only thing we have is cave paintings. And so again, I think it's important to keep this time scale in mind as we think about how much our culture is obsessed with the written word as a way of knowing the world. And yet, for the bulk of our human existence, it's had nothing to do with our understanding and our ways of being. And it's important to reconnect with our ancestry through visiting pictograph and petroglyphic sites. Also, Venus of Wollendorf, definitely, according to archaeologists, still the most widely found archaeological artifact throughout the Eurasian continent. showing that there very well may have been a matriarchal age that preceded the patriarchal age. Looking at cave paintings again and realizing that our ancestors did a lot to find different places where they could live that had optimum exposure for the fact that they were on a planet rocketing around the sun, and trying to find places to build their towns and villages that got great sunlight in the wintertime, but were protected from southern exposure in the summertime, which what you're looking at here is Canyon de Chelly, which is one of the Anasazi ruins that's on, this one's on the Navajo reservation. The one that you can take tour buses to is Mesa Verde, which is another cliff dwelling, and Chaco Canyon is also built by the same Anasazi group. But Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly are both built so that they get awesome southern exposure in the winter when the sun is running low on the horizon, because the sun tends to take a low arc in the winter. And when the sun is running high in the summer, you're not getting any of that summer sun coming into your cliff-dwelling village. Archaeoastronomy, many ancient cultures really paid attention to the rhythms of where is the solstice, where is the equinox, what are the lunar cycles. This is one of the oldest archaeoastronomical sites, again in North America. This one is in, this is in Chaco Canyon, and it's up on a mesa in Chaco. What I'm suggesting here is that a lot of our own body energy is affected by power spots and things like in geomancy that are called ley lines. And this is where I'm saying what we're looking at here is how permaculture as a design discipline is informed by metaphysical systems like dowsing and ley lines and geomancy, and is paying attention to things like geology, evolution, and the physics of how life helps to keep the planet cooler. And ultimately, that's why it is that permaculture is wanting to move us towards more complex ecological ways of producing food and energy and building materials, is so that the way in which we're growing those mimics the more mature, robust, diverse ecosystems that are doing the most work at ultimately keeping the planet cool as well. And that we're suggesting that our own body energy is influenced by whether or not we're spending time in powerful places on the Earth's surface, watching the sun rise and watching the sunset and watching the moon. And that different places on this continent have different characteristics based on their geology and their ecology and their plant and animal communities. This is a map from a discipline called physiography, which is a combination of physical geology and geography. And it's a map that's been made of North America that breaks the country down into provinces that share similar plant communities, similar climate, similar hydrology, and a similar geology. And basically, what I'm getting at here, and I know I'm already going over time, so I'm going to try to compress a lot of things into a short amount of space here. What I'm getting at here is that these bioregions are templates by which we can now put on top of them design ideas for appropriate forms of architecture, appropriate forms of energy systems, appropriate forms of agriculture. And that as we think about centering our energy, places like the island of Manhattan seem to be particularly obscure to understand how we might go about doing that. And how might we reconnect to our evolutionary history on the planet? Well, looking at maps like this, which is the Manhattan Project, where we're using this to do some redesign of part of the Lower East Side. And you can see where we're redesigning is approximately from Bowery to 14th Street down to Delancey. But what we're looking at there is what's the underneath landscape look like underneath the Lower East Side. And can we redesign whole city areas? These are green belts around Copenhagen and Stockholm. Can we redesign how it is that we live in these urban centers to reconnect with our biological and evolutionary diversity? Bringing in green roofs onto the top of buildings, using vines for the vertical in buildings, using the fact that high-rises have a lot of gravity to gravity feed water. Planting plants in the inside of buildings helps with people's sense of well-being. It cuts down on sick days. It cuts down on worker turnover. All of these things have been measured I teach classes just on how to use indoor plants to clean air in New York City because it's actually a really useful way to help people realize that plants do all kinds of things to help our lives to be better than they would be without plants, interestingly enough. Sometimes in an urban population, you're helping people realize that it's actually the microbes who live at the root zone of the plants, right, that are actually doing the work. Which is where it's interesting, as we get back to the fact that it's microbiology. It's not the leaf surface or the plant surface. Although the evapotranspiration of the plant respirating is definitely doing things to improve air quality in terms of oxygen. But the real volatile organic compound cleaning, which how many, you might ask yourself, well, the EPA estimates your average public building in the United States has 600 different volatile organic compounds floating around in the air. So we're in a public building right now. So there's probably somewhere around 600 different volatile organic compound cocktails that our immune system is right now dealing with, right? Well, you could have a bunch of allies who will help you deal with that in the form of the microbes who are living in the soil of the potted plants that you put throughout all of your buildings. And in fact, NASA did a study that shows that if you just have 3 plants for every 5 cubic feet of office space, you'll cut down on volatile organic compounds by 90%. So it's pretty interesting when we start to think about where can we bring plants back into the landscape. These are brownfields in New York City, 4,000 acres on 6,000 parcels, 60% of which sits within 500 feet of a waterway. From a design perspective, that means these are ripe candidates for creating reforested, bioremediated riparian buffer zones. The kind of thing that gets into a lot of lingo, basically saying, let's plant a bunch of trees that are native in places that right now nobody is allowed to build a high-rise or a condo anyway because they'd have to do something to clean it up to make it acceptable to develop it, which means it's ripe to come in as an environmental engineer and say, great, then let's turn this into a native forest for us to go for a walk and have more green space in a city that's full of hardscape and industrial gray world without enough green. Right? This is showing a floating walkway in China that John Todd designed that we could use in contaminated waterways like the Gowanus or like the Wallkill or other waterways that we know are getting pollutants that we aren't able to address with vegetation on the bankside. We can actually put floating walkways that have wetland plants. In this instance, it's a canal that receives open sewage that was totally toxic that after these plants were in it for 2 years, people can now swim in it and eat fish out of it, and it still receives the payload of raw sewage that it was receiving. Plants, again, really important ways to bring in air cleaning in people's lives. Bringing back in food production in container gardens. Bringing in espaliered fruit trees against the wall of buildings as ways to help keep them cool, ways to increase fruit yields, ways to use the vertical. Vines on buildings cut down on the amount of air conditioner you need by upwards of 30%, and then the right stuccos will prolong the life of the building. They also help to filter out diesel from tractor trailers sitting next to a sitting area. You know, cities are places where there's a lot of people and people are gathering, and we could be using all their poop and pee to generate power and biogas produces enough power for over 10,000 homes in Staten Island off of Fresh Kills landfill, and behaves at the tap just like propane and natural gas. And in Sweden, it's 25% cheaper at the gas pump than gasoline is. And there, again, we're not talking about trash to steam or burning trash. We're talking about taking black water, taking sewage, and using it to generate power in anaerobic digesters, which is just what the sewage treatment plants are doing. But they do it at the end of the pipe, and the stuff that's left over is really toxic waste and ends up being landfilled. Whereas if you did it at the inception at a particular business, you would be able to control what goes into the digester and end up with a sludge that was of a much higher quality in terms of being sourced and not having all the stuff from the transmission shop and the dry cleaner and the stormwater drains, which is what this system has going to it right now. Passive solar hot water, active solar, greenhouses on rooftops, vertical forests in cities. These are all ways to bring back in biology in the midst of what is a hardscape that doesn't recognize the importance of them. Recognizing what watershed we're in, what's our drainage basin. This is a shot that gives us a sense. It's something like 27,000 square miles of land that all ends up when rain lands on it in the Hudson River. And starting to design in terms of this is zooming in and showing where we are in terms of ecoregions. You can see there in the maroon is the Shawangunk Range, and you can see that on the one side is what's called the High Allegheny Plateau, and on the east side is what's called the Northern Piedmont ecoregion. And these are places that share similar climate, similar hydrology, similar geology. And it's a design tool by which we can start to bring back the old growth forest, bring back what we've squandered, pay attention to where we are in a watershed, think about wildlife corridors that actually connect the entire North American continent. And then realizing that there's little places where we can do this in these existing even suburban landscapes, where we can create these riparian buffer zones. And this is a housing development in Davis, California called Village Homes. It's a great example of permaculture suburban house development, where you start to create more collective orchards that are all owned by people, and yards that create more wildlife habitat, and buildings that are passive solar design, and opportunities for old growth forests to exist in these places that are in between the suburban homes, right? So like in these riparian zones, right? So looking at bringing back old growth and other wildlife corridors in the places where you could really put these types of plants without rearranging the landscape all that much. And in our cities, bringing back in the trees to keep the city cool, container gardening because most of our soils are contaminated, living machines as ways to also process black water and gray water, where we're using plants. This is a rest area as you come into Vermont off of New Hampshire that's designed by John Todd, where whenever you flush a toilet there, it's all being cleaned and digested by these plants that are living in greenhouses. Make a lot of sense when you're talking about a college campus. A place like the Omega Institute just built one of these so that they could stay in compliance with the DEP. These things are totally viable in terms of existing zoning code, maybe a little bit engineering and tech heavy, but as we're looking at transition approaches, these make a lot of sense when you're talking about something like the scale of a suburban housing development, a college campus, or a borough in a major city, or a municipality. They don't necessarily make sense for an individual home, or a suburban or a rural application. But what you will find scales up and scales down like that I've presented here tonight is biogas. Biogas generators are viable at a suburban home scale, at a rural village scale, and at a large municipal infrastructural scale. And we'll be seeing them. They're absolutely just a matter of time. You know, again, bringing in the plants. You know, subways are pollution zones. There's no vegetation. We've got these lights running all the time. Let's bring in these ones that NASA has shown are good at cleaning up carcinogens and benzenes and removing volatile organic compounds. Let's daylight rivers. Let's celebrate the fact we live in a place that gets 52 inches of rainfall on average, usually 48 to 52. And let's create places in our city centers where we can enjoy the solstice and the equinox and have our places where we appreciate those cycles and rhythms of the cosmos. And let's remember that we're on a planet with ancestors who go back over millions of years, traveling in outer space around the sun in a very dynamic system in a universe where it's anybody's guess as to what else is out there. Thanks, folks.